December 2023 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call this December 11th work session to order, and I will turn it over to the city manager to introduce the first topic.
Thank you, Mayor. This first work session is actually a follow-up to a combined motion that you heard earlier this year. Glad to finally have it coming to you at the end of the year. We've been cleaning up a lot of these sort of individual items. So with that, we're going to be talking about risk bonds, and Ian Penn, our sustainability manager, is going to introduce the topic, which for me was very educational because it's not normally an area we work in. So with that.
Thank you, City Manager, and good evening, Mayor and Council. I am Ian Penn, Sustainability Manager. I think just my slides going?
Yeah.
Okay. So just a quick summary of what I'm hoping to cover with Council tonight. So first, I'm going to do a recap of some previous work sessions that are related to this topic. Wanted to spend a little time clarifying a couple of definitions of key concepts, of concepts that are key to this conversation. Wanted to provide a little bit of background on what hazardous substance and hazardous site data exists and how that information is currently being used. And then I'm hoping to spend the bulk of my time really talking through a proposed framework for identifying potential hazards and assessing risk that was included as attachment C in your AIS. So just a little bit on some previous work sessions that Council has had on this. There have been several work sessions prior to this topic, including 2 sessions last year and 2 sessions back in October, one on industrial development standards and the other on gas stations. And then earlier this year, as the city manager mentioned, we had a work session that covered the fossil fuel risk bond concept and how that idea had been used in the Pacific Northwest, including some efforts in Washington State. Just a quick refresher on fossil fuel risk bonds. So the basic premise behind fossil fuel risk bonds is to safeguard public finances from the environmental and financial risk from the extraction, storage, refining, transport, and combustion of fossil fuels. So really looking at the full life cycle of these. And as a concept, really focused on major fossil fuel infrastructure. That's sort of the idea that has come up behind the fossil fuel risk bond concept. As implemented up in King County, the county actually requires that fossil fuel infrastructure owners demonstrate that they have adequate financial resources to pay for potential environmental damage. Really, in the case of King County, looking at vapor explosion and potential brownfields before they can receive a permit for a new facility. So what King County has done is focused on large fossil fuel infrastructure and focused on things that are under their permitting jurisdiction as a means to think about where they're focusing some of their financial assurance requirements under this concept. And so this work session today is a follow-up on the May work session on risk bonds and in response to a motion from Council at the end of that session. And so I'm not going to read through this motion, but the proposed assessment approach in your AIS was actually developed in response to this motion. So today's work session is really an opportunity to provide a little bit of background on chemical and hazardous substance use and data, and to discuss the proposed framework to really help build an understanding of hazard and risk across the community. And so with that little bit of background, I wanted to start with some definitions and distinguishing between 2 interrelated concepts to this discussion, focusing on hazard and risk. A hazard, quite simply, is something that is capable of causing harm. Risk, on the other hand, is all about probability. It is the likelihood of hazard causing harm and the severity of that impact. So the higher the risk, the more likely the hazard would cause harm. And really want to clarify this because they are interrelated topics. They are sometimes used synonymously, but in thinking about sort of the things that we want to think about, get better information on, think about how to address, they are separate topics and they do have different things in which you'd want to focus on when you're thinking about how to address hazard, how to mitigate hazard, and how to address risk. So a little bit to talk about hazardous chemical and hazardous substance use. This is actually a screenshot from the Oregon's Community Right to Know program. This is a program that requires facilities with certain quantities of hazardous substances to submit information to the state fire marshal. So this map that you see here is a high-level view of local reporting under this program to the state. I think something to note in modern society is that chemicals and hazardous substances can be found almost everywhere. They're used on a daily basis in our homes, where we shop, where we work, and also to do things like manufacture and process goods and services that we use in our daily lives. I think this map kind of highlights that, there's a lot of materials that are used all across this community, all across this state. I think it's also useful to recognize that the presence of a chemical does not necessarily mean that there is risk. These substances can be managed safely for a wide range of purposes and often are, but I think we also know that things happen. Substances are mismanaged, materials can be released improperly, equipment or infrastructure that uses or stores these substances can fail, companies go out of business, and locations are abandoned. And when those things happen, that leads to contamination, which is then an increase in risk to public health and the environment. And so recognizing that substances can be a threat to public health and the environment, there are laws and programs across governments that require reporting and collect data on various hazardous substances and chemicals. So attachment B in your AIS actually summarizes a bunch of these sources, but just a few highlights for council. At the federal level, there are several federal laws explicitly developed to provide information on chemicals and hazardous materials at facilities, looking at their uses, their releases. This includes reporting under the Toxic Release Inventory and some reporting under the Clean Air Act. At the state level, Oregon has its own state right to know program, which is really similar, largely mirrors Eugene's program. More facilities report to the state than under Eugene, but the programs are largely similar. The state's environmental cleanup site information database is something that tracks sites with known or potential contamination. And then locally, certain permits issued by the local air pollution control agency, LRAPA, contains data on things like hazardous air pollutants, air toxics. And then again, Eugene has its own right to know program that really focuses on reporting of a certain subset of federally listed hazardous substances. In terms of thinking about how some of that data is currently being used, it's really being used for a number of different purposes. On the emergency response side, information from right to know programs and things like hazardous material operating permits is used in emergency response planning to help prepare for and mitigate accidental chemical releases, really focusing on acute risk, emergencies, fires, things like that happen. Locally, this is something that's done through the Eugene Springfield Fire Department. Information disclosure is another really prominent use of a lot of this data. For example, in both the state and the city's right to know programs. Disclosure is really intended to provide data to improve environmental awareness, do things like track facility performance over time. Regulatory use is another prominent use. For example, Cleaner Air Oregon's emissions data is used by LRAPA to develop facility-specific health risk assessments. Those assessments are then used to inform risk-based emission levels that are written in the air permits for facilities that LRAPA actually regulates. So there's a number of different data sources being used for various purposes. However, and sort of in looking at this data, they have not necessarily been used to analyze the topics that council is looking for with its motion, at least not at the potential level of scope and complexity that a project like this might represent. So with a little bit of that background and existing data and a little bit on how some of this data is being used, I wanted to next really focus on how the city might then build a more robust understanding of potential community hazard and risk. And again, this is the focus of attachment C in your AIS. So broadly, these 5 steps or these 5 phases that you see in front of you were really designed to lay out how to accomplish the intent of council's motion at a really high level. This proposed framework is intended to first identify and understand hazard and risk based on data collection and analysis, and then use that information to really inform decisions on next steps, whether that's proceeding with a gap analysis or other sorts of decisions. More narrowly, if council wanted to proceed with this work, this framework uses a phased approach. This would focus initially on steps 1 and 2, developing what we've been calling a hazard and risk information base, really something that would be used to build sort of more understanding of current unknowns, as well as identify potential areas for further investigation. The goal here would really be to bring what has been learned during this first phase back to council, share lessons, possible recommendations. I think in talking a little bit more about kind of why we're looking at this phased approach. There's really a number of reasons behind why we're sort of looking at that as a recommendation. I think really based on some conversations that staff have had with experts in this field, this potential work is really going to be iterative, just given the sheer complexity of some of this work. A phased approach really builds in what we're calling decision gates. It's a way to kind of look at what's been learned, make decisions on best available data, and use that at those decision points to figure out what steps to take forward from there. It's also another reason is it's also unlikely that a single entity, whether a consultant or other outside expert, is going to have the inside expertise across all of these different areas that we're going to be looking at for this work potentially. Firms that might be good in one area might have a strong background in risk assessment, may not have the skill set or capacity in other areas. And so this is a way of keeping options open and considering sort of the vast expertise needed for this type of project and how to best sort of scope out work to access and take advantage of that expertise. I think another reason that staff are proposing a phased approach, if council wanted to proceed with this work, is that we believe there are sufficient resources in the current sustainability program budget to fund an initial phase of this work, but there is much more uncertainty once we get beyond that phase in terms of what resources might be needed. So if you go beyond kind of what's circled in green, because we don't really know what that first phase would tell us, it's much harder to sort of scope out what the level of effort might be. And in talking to people about kind of this broad scope of work that we might be looking at, they were a little bit remiss to actually provide sort of recommendations on that because there was just a level of uncertainty that you can't really price out. You can't really figure out what that level of effort would be. So doing it in a phase allows you to figure out a little bit more data information and then use that to think about where to take this next if this were to move forward. I think a final note on a recommendation for a phased approach, I think the information gathered and analyzed in a first phase could also provide information and have value in related topics council has been discussing. So for example, information that could help inform industrial development design standards work, or if council was interested, provide information to inform the discussion on gas stations. And so a little bit more detail on what this initial phase might entail. So this in front of you is a set of proposed tasks that would serve as the basis of a proposed statement of work to be undertaken by a consultant or outside expert. These proposed tasks have been developed based on a conversation with and feedback from outside experts across these various sort of areas, as well as staff research on various risk assessment methodologies that exist out there. There's a lot more detail on proposed activities that might occur under each one of these tasks. That's included in attachment C. I'm not going to walk through all of that, but I'm happy to answer any questions that council may have on that. I did, however, want to expand on two specific tasks on this list. I think first was focusing on project coordination and communication. I think really because a wide range of locations and facilities could be covered by this type of project. If council choose to move forward with this work, it would be really important to communicate and engage with community members, businesses, local organizations on what the city is undertaking. It would really help clarify and clearly communicate city goals and scope up front, foster stakeholder awareness, and provide some transparency into this process. Really, this is born from feedback from outside experts who had said, the importance of outreach and communication in doing risk assessment work can be really important, tends to be a standard practice. And that was really why communication was specifically called out as a task and really placed high sort of on this list. I think the second is task 3, which is data collection and analysis. As I've highlighted, there are many potential data sources that could be used to inform this analysis, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. So, again, talking to outside experts who have done this type of work in the past, they have suggested that collecting, coordinating, sifting through all this data from all these diverse sources is going to be an iterative process. You need to understand what data exists, how it was collected, under what assumptions, can it be used to inform this analysis? If so, how? If not, what are the limitations? And there's likely going to be data gaps in trying to figure out what those are and what data collection could be done to actually help fill some of those gaps. Generally, kind of the broader the scope and the more complex the analysis, the more data there is to identify, to collect, to analyze. For example, if you were to assess a single type of hazard in a specific location, that's a really different scope of work than conducting a broad analysis for multiple hazards across a community, across the city. They're just really different animals, require sort of different resources, different data, different intensity to kind of go through that work. But by starting with this process and really focusing on the data that exists, how it might be used, it would really be a useful starting point to help sort of build that better understanding of things that currently seem like they're unknown, or there's a lot of uncertainty about some of this information. So as a quick wrap up, and I know I've covered a lot, and I know there's going to be some questions, but I think the motion from council had asked for a memo. I think as we got into this work, given the potential scope and breadth of this work, along with some discussion with experts in the field that have provided a lot of insight into what is a really complex topic, it did not feel like a memo was actually going to be sufficient to help sort of navigate the complexity of this. Again, the proposed analysis framework that's in attachment C was developed both in response to council's motion and has also been refined through discussion with and feedback from outside entities with expertise across the various elements that would be in this motion. And so if council wanted to proceed with this work, staff have proposed a phased approach given the complexity and broad scope of this type of project. And so doing in phases would really be something that would be structured but also iterative to better understand a range of unknowns about hazard and risk that we currently have across the community. The phased approach would also provide some adaptability to assess what has been learned, communicate that understanding, and if council was interested, kind of use that evolving understanding, that new information to then inform further decision-making. And with that, I'll hand back to Mayor Vinis and happy to try and answer questions.
Thank you so much. This is such an interesting topic, and I appreciate how when we talk about this sort of broadly, your capacity to sort of break it down into pieces and levels of data and information that's really, it's certainly helping me sort of wrap my head around what we're really going after and how we might get there. So I really appreciate your presentation and just the way you've sort of analyzed this as a challenge and as a problem for us. So thank you very much. Are there, Randy, go for it.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ian, for the presentation. I think that was very helpful. My hope, as if we decide to go forward, which I think we should, my hope is that we do involve the business industrial community along with us so that they come along and see what we're seeing as we progress. I think that's going to be incredibly important that, you know, not just the people advocating for this, but the people it's going to impact their businesses, that they understand what we're trying to accomplish and hopefully get to the point where this is not seen as a threat, but because most of our businesses, I think, conduct themselves professionally and they have adequate resources, whether it's insurance or other means to cover unintended releases and whatnot that put people at risk. Especially concerned about an environment that's immediately dangerous to life and health, and how we make sure that we have adequate resources for example, a dioxin release, and then a company says they have the inability to pay. This is about setting up some level of assurance that we will be able to mitigate releases and contamination that is in some cases already affecting people's health. We can't go back and get the horse in the barn with that, but we can certainly try to come up with reasonable solutions that help us as we move forward, that protect our public, but also take into consideration that our industries, our businesses, our economy, our jobs can still operate. So thank you. And I guess we'll see how this unfolds, but I think your approach is very reasonable, and I think it does need to be phased in. It's just too big otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments from council? Alan?
Yeah, Ian, well done. This is very well thought out. I appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into it and all the different phases. And I also really like the phased in approach. Let's start small and kind of build. Let's kind of figure out where we're going with this as we build it. This isn't like building a plane as you're trying to fly it, but it's not dissimilar. So I think there's going to be a lot of learnings that go on. Two questions. One, what do you think is going to be the size of this? You're going to create like a database, I guess I'll call it that, of risks and hazards, or have hazards and different sorts. What do you think is going to be the size of that? I mean, thousands, or is it just going to be, you're going to try to summarize it at the beginning and start small and grow big?
I mean, gone back and forth on that in terms of discussing with outside people. I think we want to, because we're doing this, I think we want to start kind of looking with a broader universe, but it feels like you'll be able to winnow that down relatively quickly, just using kind of not common sense, but kind of thinking about kind of what things are likely to present immediate risk and what are just hazards and aren't necessarily going to be high risk as a way to winnow that down. I think the size could still be, significant. And I think thinking about how we're going to actually manage that data and present that is something that I've been talking about a little bit with prospective consultants on this. And we've been thinking through, would it be a database? Is there a way to present this information geospatially? Is there a way to use sort of technology as a way to sort of build in information to make it more accessible to people? I've come across in some of this research a lot of really interesting ways in which data is presented with maps and with GIS, and it feels like that's a really powerful way to sort of communicate a lot of complex information in a really simple way. So I think I've been thinking about how we might do something like that would allow people to sort of put information in there and figure out, sort of identify areas that might be of interest and put in a bunch of different overlays as a way to both make decisions, but also present information and help build that understanding of a lot of those things that we just don't know right now.
Yeah, having done similar kind of things, I think starting small and building it up, not pretending that we're trying to be comprehensive, but saying, okay, we're going to do this with this set and figure it out and build it up from there. And using GIS is a great idea. Doing that in my work as well, and it really works pretty amazingly well for handling all this kind of data. Another question, I've done in the past vulnerability assessments for climate change, which isn't too dissimilar from this. And are you familiar with how those are done and the guidelines that, say, California's put together for vulnerability assessments? Because I think that's really very applicable here.
I looked a little bit into that. So we've looked across a bunch of different methodologies for doing hazard mitigation assessments, how to do human health ecological risk assessments, as well as vulnerability assessments for climate. I think there's a lot of different tools out there that can be used. I'm familiar with, this is not remotely my area of expertise. But I think at a 10,000 foot level, I am aware. And some of the discussions that we've had with some outside experts suggest that, yes, there are things that could be adapted for this particular challenge, this particular thing that we're trying to get more information about. So yes, I think that would be part of this. That would certainly come out of, I feel like that, I feel like the data collection, the data analysis is going to be really essential to this. And then a lot of things are going to flow from that. Once we sort of, if this were to move forward, if we had that baseline of data, there's a lot of tools and methodology that could be brought to figure out how we use that data to then sort of do analysis and make decisions.
Yeah, all this data talk got Mike excited.
Complex water jug.
Yeah, right. So the vulnerability assessments that are done for climate really focusing on just that how do you assess the vulnerability and what level and how the gradients are done. And there's a whole bunch of different ways people have done that. But it's really interesting to kind of narrow that down and pick one that allows you then to say, okay, the vulnerability assessment for this particular hazard is, high, medium, low, and then figure out how to assess that across the board is going to be a tricky part of doing this.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, any other questions or comments from council? I have one, I'll give people a chance to think a little bit more, which is that I really appreciated your comment about emphasizing the importance of engaging with the community. And this is Randy spoke to this also, I think, as the Blue Ribbon panel has met, this is an issue, is, the timeliness of communication, understanding upfront what we're working on before it takes people by surprise. And so I just really appreciate your emphasizing that. And at how many different levels we are actually approaching the business community for a lot of different kinds of things. And so the extent to which, because this is centered in the sustainability in your work, that you're able to see all those different conversations that overlap. So I just want to appreciate that, how important that is.
And it was something that came up in discussions with experts as something that is kind of becoming standard practice in doing risk assessment work across a wide range of topics, that doing that engagement for a bunch of reasons, transparency, to identify people who could complement outside expertise. There's a lot of value in that and a bunch of different reasons.
Yeah. So thank you. That feels like a very, very important piece of this. Any other questions? Yeah.
One more comment. So for council, the value of this, I think, is going to be, we have this universe of hazards and vulnerabilities. And what this is going to do is kind of narrow that down to the ones that we should be looking at: high probability, high vulnerability, high impact. And that's going to be a discrete set that's going to be, and all the rest of it's kind of noise until you get those handled. Those are the ones that are most important.
Yeah, that's a helpful comment. Matt.
What boundaries does it know? Is it within our municipal border? Are we exploring rail that goes in and out of the municipality? Non-for-profit or government sector, public education partners who are within the municipality, our county partners? To Randy's point about business and industry, well, yes. And what about other sectors within our municipality?
I mean, I think that sort of that's kind of the universe of potential things is something that I think we'd want to flesh out with, if this were to move forward, we want to flesh out with a consultant. I think, again, we probably would start from a broader universe. I think it'd be within city boundaries. So it wouldn't be the UGB, but it'd be city as kind of the first thing. But I think, yes, kind of that map that I put up showed like there is hazard that exists everywhere. So you want to look at what that is and then figure out, based on what Councilor Zelenka said, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the potential risks by those, but looking at, all the potential sources of hazard and going from there. I think that would be part of the discussion to figure out what the scope would be and to figure out, identifying hazard and then using that next step to figure out, well, what of those hazards actually are presenting vulnerabilities and risks. I think that would be part of the process, and defining that scope would be done kind of early on as part of this conversation.
Randy, another comment?
Yes, just a quick comment. Thank you, Mayor. Building on what Councilor Keating raised, I mean, there's three basic areas. There's transportation, storage, and use. And so we need to make sure, I think, that we're covering all those areas. The transportation piece is kind of a little unique just because you have businesses that are shipping that aren't necessarily located in Eugene, but we do have product coming through that's not even stopping here. Years ago, we had a LOX truck leak that pulled off I-5 onto 105, and a very, very dangerous situation. It's like a giant thermos. In the inner wall, it cracks. It's the outer wall that was freezing and could have shattered very easily. So my point is, I don't know how we address that piece, but it's something we should at least take note in our risk assessment.
I don't have a good answer for the transportation question. It's come up. I know it's a big challenge. I think that's the one area as we've dug into a little bit of the data there, that there's going to be a significant lack of data. When trains come through or when transport trucks come through, they don't report to the fire departments. They don't report to EPA. So DOT might know a little bit about that. But so the data there is going to be really challenging. I think that's one of those places where I don't know that we'd have to see. Like that would be part where we try to figure out what data might be available and what it might tell us. But I think the transportation part is potentially a really big challenge that this analysis, it may be beyond the scope of what actually can be unearthed through part of this analysis. We'd have to look at it, but try to figure out what that might tell us.
It would be difficult from a risk bond standpoint, but just from a risk assessment point, it seems like it should be a piece of the puzzle. And we have phenol, we have all kinds of things going through our community daily.
Yeah.
When we were doing the coal trains, in this year or investigation a couple of years back, one of the things we found, it was almost impossible to find anything out from the railroads. And they wouldn't even confirm you could see a coal train. Well, we can't confirm or deny that kind of thing. And so it's going to be very difficult for the transportation going through, especially that and airports and trucks. And I would think that those would be extraneous to this initial part of it, because that's just going to be so difficult to get at. We just want to focus in on the things that we know.
Right. Bach and crude is another one, but I mean, it still seems like it needs a place in the assessment. And I'm guessing the fire department would be a good resource to enlist in that.
It strikes me not in the context of our immediate work here, but But this work highlighting that particular problem that communities all over the country are facing of what's getting transported through their community and what hazards are they exposed to. And that's a federal conversation, actually. And, you know, as we develop data, it sets us up to sort of have that federal conversation, which seems like it would be pretty constructive. So, yeah, thank you.
In the end, you know, the only thing we could come up with on the coal trains was you can't block an intersection for more than 4 minutes.
Mm.
And that was a local public safety issue as opposed to regulating the railroads. And that issue got resolved in a different way, but we ended up not doing that.
Yeah, interesting.
But you can get at, so that was a good example of getting at dealing with an issue in a roundabout way that still can be effective.
Yeah, it's really, thank you very much for this work. It's really interesting and feels, so I guess I need to turn to you for a motion.
Yes. I had
Yeah,
a question
sorry,
about
almost forgot.
timing. When is, so have you done, you haven't done the RFP yet? So, because you're waiting for us to say, yes, go forward. What's the timing for all of that?
In terms of getting to RP or getting to work started or getting information back.
RFP to contract to getting the work started to getting the first phase done.
I haven't totally thought through getting to an RFP. I think yet if something were in place, I have been told anywhere from 12 to 15 months to do data collection, do data analysis, and kind of come up with kind of that first swing of looking at vulnerability, looking at risk from the time a contract would be in place. I think getting something in place would be, 4 to 6 weeks, something like that, to get an RFP ready. So RFP out for a month, evaluate responses. I think one of the things that we've been thinking about is, because I'm not expert in this and, I've learned a little bit in the last couple of months, but possibly working with somebody to sort of flesh out a scope. I think what I've learned is coming up with a really good scope of work is going to be really critical to actually getting information that's going to be actionable out of this process. And so working with somebody to kind of further refine and flesh out a scope of work feels like it'd be really essential for this, to actually come up with a set of sort of asks and criterias and steps that would actually allow this to be done, one, in phases, and two, to kind of build in some of those decision points to actually, I could see doing a gap and doing a data analysis and seeing what's there, what could be used, doing a gap analysis there, like what don't we have? And then that's why it's going to have to be iterative. So it's a little bit hard, but in talking to people saying, okay, we think we have data from these sources, we have to see if it's useful. They thought somewhere from 12 to 15, 16 months once work got going to actually they thought the data, there might be a couple cycles of going through data and then running different scenarios and then thinking about how best to present some of that information.
Yeah, when I work with my team, we call that going slow to go fast. So thinking about the scope of work and really nailing that down and spending a lot of time on it, you get better proposals, but then you can accelerate really fast once you get the work done. But how long that data collection thing, I would suspect, is really related to the scope of what you put the fence around this and how many hazards you're going to deal with. If you're going to start smaller, maybe not take that long.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would
comprehensively.
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to the people who are expert in this on this, but yes, I think that the scope could be determinative on this. Yes, I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. I think with that, Randy, we're ready for a motion.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to direct the city manager to proceed with steps 1 and 2 as set out in attachment C to this AIS entitled Eugene Hazard and Risk Assessment Framework.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 opposed. 1. All right, that passes 6-1. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Ian, for walking us through that and helping us get to the next place. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mayor and Council.
Okay, so our second item of on the agenda tonight is discussion of a resolution calling for peace and in opposition to war. And this is a resolution that has been developed, drafted by Randy, Matt, and Lindsay. And so they presented it to you a week ago. And I'm just going to open up the floor to, and could be that Randy and Matt might want to speak to this first since they drafted this, but I just want to say a couple of things about this before we dive into it. And I think, first of all, is my appreciation and gratitude for all of you for even going this far, looking at developing a resolution, considering it. This is not an easy thing to do. And I think we're all recognizing the emotions that everyone is feeling and the intensity of this. I think we've heard just in the last couple of days, we've heard from members of the community who think we should leave this alone completely and not say anything. And we've heard from other members of the community who think we should be much more bold and much more forceful. And so I'm just going to say two things about my perspective on that. And the first is that I don't think that council's comments on this war are going to influence the trajectory of the war. We have no access to diplomacy. We have no access to the diplomatic part of this. But what we do know is that this war is deeply affecting people within our community. Our Jewish community, our Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim community, they are all deeply impacted. Many of them have personal connections. They are not combatants in this war, but they are victims of it and in all respects. And I think it is important for this council to pay attention to the impact on our own community. We have a value of being a culture of belonging, and this is a moment to reassure everyone in our community that they can live with safety here and with dignity. And the second piece I want to share here is that as individuals, all of us have an opinion about this situation. But this is not the moment for all of those individual political perspectives. This is a moment for the council to stand in support of our community, and our community, again, being a safe place where everyone is safe, whatever their perspective and whatever their personal experience. So I'm proud of this council for considering it, to coming to this moment, and very grateful to the three councilors who worked so hard to craft this resolution. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. And I appreciate your words. Going back 3.5 weeks ago, I was in a completely different place than I am now. I started off thinking, why would a local government in Oregon get involved in an international issue when we have so many things here that are affecting people every day right in our community? And about 3 weeks ago, I had a conversation with the mayor, and she pointed out what she just said about how this is affecting people here locally. And I've heard from a number of people here locally as well. Folks are scared. Our hate crimes are up over 300% nationally, and similar statistics here locally. People have been threatened. People have received hate speech. We have been subjected to that as a council on 3 occasions. And, you know, that's something that I take seriously. I think one of our primary jobs, responsibilities, missions is to assure the safety, health, safety, and welfare of those who live in, pass through, work, or recreate in Eugene's boundaries. And so I have a very different perspective today than I had 3 weeks ago. And I thank you, Mayor, for changing my mind and reorienting my own perspective. And so this to me is about people who live here, who are experiencing the hate associated and connected to this war. We have very little, if any, control over. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to speak?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I also want to thank Councilor Leach and Human Rights Commission leadership for lending their thoughts as well. From my perspective, the horrific attacks on October 7th, followed by weeks of war in Gaza, are difficult to process, easy to abhor, and impossible to ignore. So as an elected body, it's my opinion that we have a responsibility to underscore values revolving around fundamental human rights. And I find it appropriate that we are doubling down as an elected body, albeit local in all our small corner of the globe, to call for peace and to fundamentally oppose war in all forms. So is this resolution perfect? By no stretch of the imagination. But is it a strong value statement that's consistent with this council's previous actions and our stated federal legislative policies revolving around equity and inclusion? Yes. I urge unanimous adoption, colleagues. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wishing to speak to this? Alan?
Yeah, I agree. Eugene City Council is not affected what's going on in the Middle East. But it certainly is impacting our community in many different ways. And the October 7th attack by Hamas was horrible, and the Israelis' response has also been horrible. Bottom line for me is war is horrible, and it should be avoided at all costs. And peace and negotiation is a better way to go about it. I was part of the 23% that said we shouldn't go to war in Iraq, and stood up and said that. But I think this resolution shows that we're listening, that we are paying attention to what's going on, that it is impacting our community, and it says where we stand. And people may question why we're even doing this. I think I just addressed that, and others may say it's not going far enough. I don't want to wordsmith this. I very much appreciate the work that Randy and Matt and Lindsay put together, and others in putting this together. And so I will support the resolution as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? All right, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna jump in,
Okay, thank you.
Seen a bunch of activity. What we're seeing in the packet, I just want to draw this to your attention. What we saw in the packet was the resolution is missing paragraph E. If you look, it
Oh, it
jumps
is.
down from C, D, and then goes
Yes.
to F.
Yes.
I presume that wasn't,
It's here, right here, but not.
it's different than the one that was circulated. So if you, Counselor Groves, if I can hand you this computer and you can make the motion and then say with the addition and just read E, it will make sure that you get adopted what you want to have adopted, and the one that is signed will include E, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, we
Which
do
one
want
was
E.
missing?
So it's paragraph E is missing in the document.
Good catch. I thought
Good
that's
catch.
So much today. Thank you, Catherine.
Okay.
And then say with the inclusion of paragraph
I don't want
It's
that.
that. Oh, you have it.
We have
But
it.
it's not in the attached AIS.
It's not on
Online.
it's not on the digital
Online.
piece. I don't-
Digital one.
If you read it, and then just make sure that says with the inclusion of, just to make sure
Okay.
everybody's acting on the same thing.
Okay. I think I have it. If not, you'll correct me.
Go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. Move to adopt a resolution calling for peace and in opposition to war as set forth in attachment A with the inclusion of E. We have a moment to stand for peace with clarity about the depth of pain and the challenge of compromise that is required.
Second,
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That passes unanimously. Thank you all very, very much. I'm grateful to you for your leadership and your courage and your standing up for peace. So thank you. And with that, we are adjourned.